Hi, I'm Jacob Foster. For once, I'm not going to talk about the Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute. Instead, I'd like to tell you about the framework I'm proposing called How Complex Wholes Become Smarter Than Their Parts. This is definitely a team effort, so I should acknowledge my partners in thought crime, Carl Bergstrom, David Krakauer, Melanie Mitchell, and Rajesh Rao. I should also thank Pranav Das and Erica Cartmill for invaluable discussion and feedback. So let's dive in. The fundamental claim behind our framework is simple. Intelligence is an emergent property of complex systems, collections of possibly diverse agents that learn or adapt when they interact. On this view, two factors are key to system intelligence. One, composable diverse subsystems, which themselves possess some intelligence and agency, and two, mechanisms that coordinate the activity of select subsystems so that their collective behavior allows the system to adapt to its circumstances. Our framework proposes to search the space of naturally occurring diverse intelligences for design principles associated with these two factors, which we call, for shorthand, compositionality and mechanism design. We'll develop tools for extracting these principles and patterns from naturalistic and experimental data. We'll translate these into formal models and test their emergent properties by implementing them in computational and experimental platforms, including social experiments. This framework will produce an explanatory toolkit for the DI community. It will also provide AI researchers with new biomimetic design paradigms that can radically increase AI capacity while guiding the design of new institutions that increase the collective intelligence of humans and machines. Let's dive into the perspective behind this framework on the sorts of systems we're talking about when we talk about intelligences. The diverse intelligences community has revealed the remarkable capacities that emerge in systems of diverse form and format. Now, crucially, these systems are all collectives at some level of analysis. Individual organisms and interesting tissues like brains are collectives of cells. Groups of human and non-human animals create elaborate societies and cultural traditions that tie them together across space and time. Deep learning, the dominant approach to artificial intelligence, gains its power from combining simple units into complex architectures. Regardless of form or format, intelligence is a multi-scale phenomenon. Mike Levin memorably captured this in the slogan, "Cognition all the way down." So consider a paradigm case of collective intelligence, science. Science is a complex adaptive system for learning robust explanations of natural phenomena. Its components, human scientists, robots, algorithms, reagents, papers, and protocols, vary in their agency and their cognitive capacity. If we then consider an individual human scientist, we find agency and information processing throughout the collective of cells from which she's built, from organs and tissues to individual cells. We think it is a misunderstanding to view intelligence as a property of durable things. The systems that manifest intelligent behavior exist on a range of timescales. They're often ephemeral. Reaching for a coffee cup in a novel context involves the recruitment of perceptual and motor circuits that may never be assembled in quite that way again. The solution of a scientific problem may bring together a constellation of expertise that only persists until the problem is solved. One of the grand challenges in contemporary AI research is program induction. For example, the ability to assemble on the fly perceptual, semantic, and generative subroutines to answer detailed questions about an image. And of course, intelligence can also transcend the lifetime of specific parts. Science is a striking example of this. So in other words, cognition all the way down seems to obtain in both space and time. So if intelligence is collective and multi-scale in space and time, a shift in perspective is required. Rather than viewing intelligence as a stable property of certain things, intelligence can be viewed as the emergent result of processes that take place in complex adaptive systems. Such complex systems routinely create subsystems of variable duration whose collective behavior allows the system to master its circumstances. From this perspective, A key challenge in diverse intelligences is identifying the principles and design patterns that allow such transient systems to emerge, be refined, become stabilized, and combine in turn to produce more sophisticated adaptive capacity. This framework takes up the challenge, searching the space of diverse intelligences for such principles and design patterns. So how do we define intelligence in a complex adaptive system? Fundamentally, intelligence endows systems with a capacity for causal control. So let S denote the state space of a complex adaptive system and E denote the state space of its environment. Well, given some particular state of the system and its environment, intelligence reflects the ability of the system to influence the stochastic dynamics of subsets of itself and its environment so that the overall system is more likely to take a desirable path through state space. What's desirable, of course, depends on the current goal, purpose, or task. This, in turn, depends on the state of the system and its environment. So, for example, when a hungry dog is in the presence of food, this can be abstractly viewed as making most desirable the joint state where the food is in the dog's belly. With respect to the value structure that's induced by the current goal or the current task, we can then measure the benefit of the future trajectory of the system and environment. We can likewise compute the cost of that trajectory, taking into account the time, the energy, and the other resources that are expended by the system. Comparing the benefits and the costs then gives us a simple measure of the system's intelligence with respect to that task. Even when the same end state is reached, when an external observer would judge the task to be met, the problem solved, the benefits and costs of distinct trajectories can be compared. We would expect learning dynamics on a task to increase the benefits or to drive down the costs. In other words, over time, systems should follow more and more optimal trajectories when confronted with the same task. Note, however, that this picture only quantifies the narrow intelligence of the complex adaptive system relative to that task. When we speak of the intelligence of an organism or a collective, we usually have in mind its capacity to cope with many tasks, perhaps with some it's never seen before. This broader capacity can be described in the same framework. When the complex adaptive system encounters a task, it invokes or creates a sub-intelligence to solve the task by setting up an internal stochastic dynamical system whose dynamics robustly produce a performant subsystem. This capacity for meta-intelligence, if you will, can be quantified in the same way as we described before, comparing the performance of the resulting sub-intelligence to the cost of creating or maintaining it. So then there are two frameworks for comparing the intelligence of multiple complex adaptive systems, or a system to itself. We can compare them on a specific goal or task, or we can compare them on the range of goals, tasks, or environments in which they display intelligent behavior. For example, outcomes that are better than those that would arise from random behavior. In other words, we can make either quantitative or qualitative comparisons. In this framework, we believe that quantitative differences in intelligence with respect to a specific task are associated with the stabilization or refinement of a dedicated sub-intelligence for that task, which allows the system to follow gradually higher value and or lower cost trajectories. This would be the domain of learning over an organism's lifespan, or of incremental evolution over cultural or phylogenetic time. By contrast, we claim that qualitative differences in intelligence, for example, related to the range of goals and environments, those are associated with changes in the composition of the complex adaptive system, adding or subtracting new stable sub-intelligences, and especially with increased capacity to assemble novel intelligent subsystems on the fly. This would be the domain of learning to learn over an organism's lifespan, or evolving to learn over cultural or phylogenetic time. It's also intimately associated with questions of analogy, something Melanie Mitchell on our team has studied very deeply. Our core hypothesis is that the capacity to deal with novelty, the hallmark of intelligence, depends on two things: The presence of composable, diverse subsystems, which themselves possess some intelligence and agency, and mechanisms that coordinate the activity of select subsystems so that their collective behavior allows the system as a whole to adapt to its circumstances. Compositionality and mechanism design are key. So what is compositionality? Well, compositionality has emerged as a critical notion in contemporary artificial intelligence research. It's viewed as one of the key ingredients to more human-like AI, able to combine existing abilities to generalize beyond a narrow task. Compositionality is a property of representations, or more generally in our language, intelligences, that allows them to be easily put together, to be composed, so that their individual properties build something new. It's a key property of symbolic systems. For example, words are composed in a sentence to generate its possible meanings. The angry bear chased the frightened little squirrel. Hope it's okay. But compositionality is also a crucial aspect of perception. Scenes are understood as composed of objects. Development. Bodies are composed of organs and tissues. Motor behavior. Movements are composed of a sequence of interconnected sub-movements. Or planning. A plan to walk to the office involves a sequence of sub-plans, from getting dressed to selecting a route and opening the door, and so forth. In other words, any activity where wholes are built from parts. Compositionality also makes generalization easy. If I know how to identify a coffee cup and I know how to reach for things, well, I can successfully pick up a coffee cup on the first try, so long as the sub-intelligences that carry out these two tasks are easily composed. Compositionality is also critical to managing the computational complexity of things like learning or planning and other kinds of cognition. If computations can be performed at a higher level of abstraction, one afforded by representations, sub-intelligences that easily compose, then the space in which a system has to search to perform some combinatorial optimization and so forth is much smaller. This is especially salient in the context of something called hierarchical reinforcement learning. In domains like complex motor activity, it's intractable to learn a policy at the smallest level of granularity, but it's easier to do so at multiple levels. For example, a policy at the level of options, sort of sequences of motor actions, with sub-policies that fill in the lower level details of a particular option. This is something that Raj Rao and his group has been working on actively. Of course, compositionality also applies in multi-agent settings. For example, scientists, seen here working together, they take advantage of a range of simple systems of communicative modalities in order to coordinate their activities and manage their division of labor. This would be totally intractable to do if, for example, when an experimentalist passes experimental results to a theorist, it has to be done in raw form rather than some easily digestible figure that could then be compared to a theoretical prediction. And I've also studied this compositionality issue a bit in multi-agent reinforcement learning settings. We might talk about this in one of the sessions. In this framework, compositionality is a key property of the sub-intelligences that work together to support more sophisticated capacities. Cognition all the way down would be computationally hopeless in both learning and execution if the intelligences at different levels of analysis did not compose easily. So we have some conjectures. First, we conjecture that complex adaptive systems across the space of diverse intelligences have invented a range of strategies that make their building blocks composable at multiple scales. We also conjecture that a critical feature of the most flexible systems is a kind of compositional strategy that goes beyond a single fixed hierarchy. So sub-intelligences can take part in many different emergent intelligences, more or less as needed. This is not only more efficient, it also ensures more robust sub-intelligences. They have to work reliably across many different tasks, so that helps them become better. Now, mechanism design is a logical necessity. Given this picture, that I've described of subintelligences that can meaningfully be viewed as cognitive agents with their own goals, their own input and output, and their own internal dynamics. Once you're dealing with agents, you need to design a mechanism, an institution, a procedure, a game, an architecture, an interaction protocol, a reward system, something that shapes their interaction and their dynamics such that they collectively produce the desired emergent behavior. Now, in economics, mechanism design, sometimes called reverse game theory, refers to the design of a mechanism, and here I'm quoting Eric Maskin, institution, procedure, or game for determining outcomes such that strategic agents will achieve a desired outcome. We use mechanisms somewhat more liberally to refer to architectures, interaction protocols, incentives, reward structures that shape agent behavior, and mechanism design in our sense as the challenge of selecting a mechanism that will lead to specific collective behavior. For example, behavior that implements some information processing or collective sensing capability. Now, mechanism design in economics, which is a very technical field, has focused on a small set of mechanisms, chiefly auctions and voting rules. And if you want a nice accessible example of this, Eric Maskin, one of the leaders of mechanism design in economics, has a nice piece on this from the Santa Fe Institute's COVID-19 transmission series that gives a nice example in a COVID context of mechanism design. Mechanism design has also become critical in machine learning research. One of the most successful recent architectures, the generative adversarial network architecture, is based on an explicit game theoretic formulation of the learning problem and the way the parts fit together, as are a range of generalizations of those architectures for putting multiple learners together in a sort of game structure. But the study of diverse intelligences has surfaced a plenitude of alternatives to these things we've talked about so far. As David Krakauer and his collaborators have shown, primate groups use a sort of two-phase system to compute the power structure in their societies, in which pairwise information accumulation is then followed by information aggregation. I have argued that the fields in which scientists jockey for position and scientific capital can be mapped onto a hybrid genetic neural architecture called a classifier system, and that this may explain why deeply social and historical processes like the ones that we believe operate in science can nonetheless produce transhistorical truths about the natural world. Contemporary cognitive neuroscience suggests that multiple systems, model-based, model-free, and episodic reinforcement learning, compete and sometimes cooperate to control behavior, while the entire point, on some accounts, of the dopamine reward system may be to train the prefrontal cortex so that it operates as its own freestanding learning system. I'm quoting here from a Nature article by Matt Botvinnik's group. In other words, to design a mechanism for reinforcement learning on the fly. Learning to reinforcement learn. The immune system has an elegant distributed mechanism for covering the space of possible antigens and then honing in to produce better and better representations of actual pathogens confronting the system. This may be related to ideas in multi-scale optimization and also share some design principles with ant foraging and task allocation, something Melanie Mitchell has argued. There are other examples, developmental and regenerative processes, the kinds of things that Mike Levin and his group have studied, even evolutionary dynamics itself, which after all inspired the powerful genetic algorithm approach to machine learning and more recently architecture search. So our third conjecture is that complex adaptive systems across the space of diverse intelligences have invented a range of approaches to mechanism design. The details of those mechanism design approaches, of course, depend on the history of the system as well as the nature of the agents involved. By considering a range of such mechanisms, we may be able to identify some overarching principles and some patterns in biomimetic mechanism design. We believe mechanisms will fall into broad taxonomies. For example, whether noise is suppressed or noise is used as part of the mechanism. whether agency of components is largely preserved or is substantially reduced. And of course, we think that mechanism and compositionality principles are likely to co-evolve. So mechanism design approaches co-evolve with strategies for compositionality. Now, our claim that cognition all the way down implies mechanisms all the way up has another implication, namely that a concept called the price of anarchy is deeply relevant. The price of anarchy roughly reflects the cost of producing an outcome by agents that act under some mechanism, quantified by comparing the system performance in that case to some optimal, the best possible performance. This is also related to a kind of interplay between top-down control and bottom-up emergence. We conjecture that the price of anarchy will be highest when little learning has happened, either ontogenetically through development or phylogenetically on evolutionary time. But as the lower level units are remodeled and the mechanism is tweaked to provide a better guiding institution for those agents, the price of anarchy should decrease. Of course, there are trade-offs. For example, with learning, as the price of anarchy decreases, it's also likely to be the case that the autonomy and the repurposability of agents may also decrease unless there's something that pushes against that, which of course means the price of anarchy can't fall quite as much as it would otherwise. On the other hand, frequently invoked, reliable, efficient combinations of mechanisms and agents, if they're frozen in as components, those combinations can then be reused as building blocks at yet higher levels. As a rather dramatic example, consider the fact that the intelligence of evolution as a general heuristic for mechanism design has increased over time precisely because evolution has learned how to build more composable parts. For example, more plastic genetic architectures or bioelectric tissues. It's devised mechanisms for recombining those more composable parts at lower cost. Brute natural selection is the most wasteful mechanism. Learning in brains is much, much less wasteful. So let's turn to our broad strategy. As I alluded at the beginning, there are 3 steps. Identify compositional principles and mechanisms across several strategically selected cases, translate the resulting system into formal models, and then implement things in silico or in social experiments to see if those mechanisms and compositional principles can flexibly produce the desired emergent capacities. We'll draw on a broad secondary literature as we search for compositional principles and mechanisms, but we've selected some cases for empirical work that have been less explored in the larger DI community, particularly neural recordings from humans, especially ECOG recordings from individuals who are performing novel tasks, potentially in VR settings, and collective behavior, especially in human and non-human primates. We think that these strategically selected cases will provide a rich set of patterns and help us understand when the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. To identify principles and mechanisms, we'll leverage and develop tools for extracting them from naturalistic and experimental data, e.g. behavior mining from joint neural and video recordings, extensions of inductive game theory, probabilistic generative models of, say, problem selection or group formation in science, inference of mean field games from collective behavior data, etc. Now, a key challenge here is going to be developing efficient tools to identify emergent intelligences and their boundaries. And here we can draw on ideas related to the information theory of individuality, something that David Krakauer and other colleagues at SFI have developed, and a linked notion of Markov blankets. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in both of these cases to make them computationally practical. We're also especially interested in insights from pathological cases, dyspraxia and motor behavior, out of control conflict, senescent scientific fields, and especially misinformation. This is something Carl Bergstrom has thought very, very deeply about, and we think this is an interesting and important site for further investigation. A related issue of interest to This framework group has to do with understanding what makes particular tasks difficult for particular systems. So returning to our overall strategy, having identified principles, in the second step, we'll build formal models that are based on these empirical investigations. We'll also seek to formalize principles and mechanisms derived from the secondary literature. For example, Rajesh has developed this powerful hypernetwork formalism, neural networks that generate other neural networks more or less. And where possible, we'll analyze these kinds of formal models mathematically. Otherwise, we move to the third step, building practical implementations of the abstracted system, matching their compositional principles and mechanism designs. Some of these implementations will be computational, others will be social experiments in which real humans participate together in some simulated environment. And this step, we think, will provide a critical playground for testing our key claims, like the ability of the mechanism to produce some desired behavior, its robustness to changes in the compositionality of parts, the decrease of the price of anarchy over learning. One interesting domain for human-machine collaboration is mass-producing moonshine, not like this, but rather like the monstrous moonshine correspondence, a really intriguing relationship between two seemingly unrelated mathematical sequences, one from number theory on the left, one from group theory, with the variables on the right, R1, R2, et cetera, being the dimensions of the irreducible representations of the monster group. This relationship was essentially noticed by accident. Someone noticed that these two sequences of numbers, which had weird numbers in them, seemed like there might be some way to map them, and figured out what the map was. It eventually led to a Fields medal and a thriving field at the intersection of mathematics and physics. So such moonshine type conjectures, maps between integer sequences, could be a really promising site for new architectures of human and machine collaboration, with machines discovering interesting correspondences and humans annotating, evaluating, and maybe with machine assistance proving that. We are keen to engage with the broader DI community. I think our framework plays exceedingly well with the other frameworks. It likewise connects to a number of the synthesis projects. It would be fascinating to explore mechanism design with great apes in virtual reality, or in cases of basal cognition. In general, we think our framework could build fruitful collaborations across DI projects, some of the natural interlocutors being ethologists, social scientists, as well as AI folks and modelers, particularly those who are interested in innovation, novelty, collective behavior. Our framework has clear implications for methodology and explanation in DI. On the methodology side, practically it suggests researchers who are working at any level, on any system, can productively search for principles of compositionality and try to identify the mechanisms that orchestrate competent system behavior on one or more tasks. As our framework develops a repertoire of compositional principles and mechanisms, it will also allow DI researchers to proceed towards explanations abductively, bringing a conjectured mechanism to their system and creating opportunities for surprise, as well as the discovery of new mechanisms if that conjectured mechanism or principle doesn't work out. We hope our framework will offer the community a computational toolkit, something that researchers can use to easily implement conjectured mechanisms to see whether they work as expected. Now, of course, there are also opportunities to reject some of our core hypotheses, like if there are only a few or singular compositional principles or mechanisms, if systems display intelligent behavior without exploiting compositionality, or if these ideas work in some corners of DI, most obviously in collectives built out of independent organisms, but not in others. Most significantly, we think our framework represents a great chance for the DI community to contribute to important conversations about the future of artificial intelligence and the design of new human institutions. There is widespread recognition that new ideas are needed in both AI and institutional design. These demand understanding and imagination together. As the great Brazilian-American social theorist Roberto Mangabeira Unger put it, to understand a state of affairs is just to grasp what that state of affairs might become under certain provocations or with certain circumstances that we impose on it. In other words, understanding and imagination are linked. And in the long run, our framework can help DI researchers, AI researchers, social scientists move from studying what is to what could be, a science of possible collective intelligences, possible futures, possible worlds. You can take inspiration here from a beautiful little essay on the end of physics ? By the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, Robert Dijkgraaf. And I quote, "All of this is part of a much larger shift in the very scope of science, from studying what is to what could be. In the 20th century, scientists sought out the building blocks of reality, the molecules, atoms, and elementary particles out of which all matter is made, the cells, proteins, and genes that make life possible, the bits, algorithms, and networks that form the foundation of information and intelligence, both human and artificial. This century, instead, we will begin to explore all that there is to be made with these building blocks," end quote. Our framework aims to discover the design principles that can guide such exploration of what can be built in diverse intelligences. Our framework aims to discover design principles that will allow us as a field to move from studying and understanding what is to imagining and building what could be. There are lots of deep questions on which we'd appreciate your input. Have we got the right model systems? What's the best formalism for compositionality? Is it some applied category thing or something else? There are philosophical and ethical ramifications of all of this that really need investigation. And of course, we'd love to hear your thoughts about how you can engage with this framework. If you recall our fundamental claim, intelligence is always collective. We are so pleased that we get to engage with this wonderful community and produce a deeper understanding of diverse intelligences together. Thanks to the folks who've supported and stimulated all of this thinking, and thanks to you for your time, your attention, and your curiosity.